Welcome, everyone. And now Don Shor will give us an overview of our presentations today.
Great. Thank you very much for coming. This is a great turnout for the topic of urban forestry for your neighborhood. I'm Don Shor. I have a business here in town. I'm also a board member of Tree Davis, as is our speaker, Emily Griswold, and our president of Tree Davis is Dr. Greg McPherson. And we'll each be presenting to you an overview of urban forestry principles and practices, hopefully bringing it down as much as we possibly can to the level of your neighborhood. This was sponsored under the auspices of Rancho Yolo and Village Homes, and we really like that fact because they're two very different neighborhoods in terms of tree issues, but they also represent problems and issues and opportunities, to be more positive, I should say, all around the city of Davis and elsewhere in Sacramento Valley. It has been a tough summer and a tough couple of years for a lot of tree species. And so we want to talk about some ways you at the neighborhood level can do things to improve the health of our urban forest, just by planting trees, watering them, getting actively involved, and knowing how to do it right. So I believe at this point, I take over the screen, but I want to mention questions can be, if I recall from our introduction, can be written and posted. Chris can correct me if I've got this wrong, and we'll go through them as we can. There will also be periods in there specifically for questions for at least a few minutes. With this number of participants, I wanted to leave time at the end as well for follow-up questions. So I think there'll be an opportunity to answer questions during and then after the main part of the program. I'm going to go ahead and take over the screen now. And
yes, please feel free while the presenters are speaking to fill in questions that you have in the chat.
So we live in an area that has some great big mature beautiful trees, and we live in an area where there's neighborhoods that don't have as many as they should. I recently wrote an article a bit about the history of trees in this area, and it follows the trajectory of urban forestry throughout the country. You have the native trees in the region, which we don't have that many of here, but here's an example of a native oak. There were trees planted in Woodland and Davis in particular 100+ years ago, heavily elms and walnuts and sycamores, plane trees. Some are still with us, some are not, and that's a fairly typical pattern. And then a big expansion at the suburban level of trees after World War II, a whole lot of trees planted as the elms died out across the United States in the 30s, and suburbs and subdivisions were built in the 40s. So many of you live or walk through neighborhoods with cohorts of trees 50, 60, 80, even 100 years old. And then there are other neighborhoods where there are not enough trees. So we want to adapt to all of those situations as we speak. Tree Davis is responding to a real urgent need in the community. One of the articles Greg and I wrote a few years ago, we did comment that we're losing more trees than we are planting. That was a back of the envelope calculation I did with the city arborist, and I think unfortunately it's still true. I think it will certainly be true in the next few years after the extreme heat events that we had this summer and several years of drought taking out or seriously injuring or weakening certain tree species, which we'll certainly get into shortly. But our goal, aside from planting trees, and we've now planted over 13,000 of them, and working with volunteers, we've worked with hundreds and hundreds of volunteers to get trees planted, is we want to do outreach, educational outreach to teach people how literally to plant and care for trees. And we get great turnout at our events, lots of folks from the university, lots of folks from all across the spectrum in Davis to come out and learn about how to not just plant trees, stake them, prune them if necessary, mulch around them, manage the weeds, and how to water them. The crucial aspects of getting a new tree established, either in a turf area as shown here, or in many non-turf areas. Just as an example, Tree Davis has just finished planting over 100 oak trees all the way down Russell Boulevard, from Highway 113 to the edge of town. And our staff and volunteers are hand watering those trees every 2 weeks to get them to establish, and they're doing very, very well. So we're out there planting trees in unirrigated situations and in turf areas and everything in between. And sometimes our education works, And sometimes it doesn't. I've been watching this poor Raywood ash die for more than 20 years now. And we know why it died. We know why this did not work. And it really enumerates many of the principles that I want to cover very briefly. Raywood ash has been getting a borer that decimates them in the valley since before this species was planted. So obviously it wasn't a good choice. A tree in a parking lot needs root volume. Give it enough soil space. Clearly this didn't get that. Plant it correctly. Okay, I can see the root flare. They probably planted it correctly. Water the young tree regularly. That may have happened. Continued irrigation clearly did not happen. And one thing, if you look through the picture at the one on the other side of the parking lot that's clearly doing well, larger irrigation area. And when it does work, when you have landscaping that is also getting irrigated, you can get a tree to grow even in a very harsh and adverse environment, such as reflected heat off of an asphalt pavement. This picture is from Bakersfield. So if they can do it there, we can certainly do it here in terms of the valley heat. This is a really core principle that I love everybody to internalize, that it's a range of ages and species that's the key to our urban forest. So what typically happens is a whole neighborhood is built, a whole bunch of trees are planted all at once, and then not much happens. And Village Homes is a very good example of a neighborhood that has, I believe it's 135 or something like that, Chinese tallow trees that were planted in the late 1970s. The lifespan of Sapium sebiferum, older name for it, is considered to be about 50 years. So they're reaching the end of their natural life. One whole cohort of trees is going to need to be replaced. They're not necessarily falling down or dying, but they're aging. So a plan for their replacement is important. And you're going to have a gap in urban canopy or in shading of parking lots and so forth if you don't plan as the years go by, every 10 or 15 years, evaluating the trees in your community, in your neighborhood, and getting new trees planted. We are losing species, and it's pretty obvious which ones. The drought, 5 years of drought in the last 10 years have made a significant impact on certain species. We now consider those species unsuitable, but they're still out there, coast redwood being the best example. Insufficient species diversity, too much of all the same thing on one street or one block or one neighborhood. And real important, arborists know about this, new pests on the horizon that are threatening our existing trees and that may determine what species we put in for the future. So I probably don't need to preach to the choir about the good things trees do. But these are some of the things when I give presentations to school groups, for example, the way they moderate the local climate and they conserve energy. Urban heat island effect. Well, just 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had a heat emergency here in the Sacramento Valley. We hit some record temperatures, 116 degrees in downtown Sacramento and Davis, 2 days in a row, both of those records. And certain surfaces are way hotter in that situation. The thing that effectively cools them is trees or any kind of landscaping. Trees and irrigated landscaping make our environments more habitable. The air cleaning, air purifying benefits of trees are very obvious, although they've certainly been quantified as well. And I do think that there's some cultural and historical aspects to trees. There was a weeping willow on Oak Avenue for 50 years. It was much beloved. People in town all knew that tree. There was great sadness when it came out. And I always thought that was fascinating because that tree had been there actually since the 1960s. So in that period of time, 50, 60 years, people in Davis developed an attachment to a particular tree. The lifespan of a tree, a question I get very commonly, 50 to as much as 200 years or more. There are oak trees here that are well over 300 years old. So I like to show this because it shows on the left, tree canopy coverage of the city, and on the right, surface temperature of the city. And so purple areas are lack of tree canopy, and red areas on the right are high temperatures. Now, I was showing this to a lady, and it really illustrates the direct impact that tree canopy has. I said, now you need to understand, this is just the surface, the asphalt down there at ground level. This isn't where we are 5, 6 feet up in the air. And she said, it's where our pets are. It's where our toddlers are. So she made a very good point. In a heat emergency with 110 to 115 degrees, that's life-threatening down at that level. And trees and landscapes and irrigated landscapes, but also even unirrigated trees shading over a surface can make a big difference on the direct temperature. Urban heat island effect is very well illustrated here. I live out in the country. I have great big trees over my house. When it was 112 in Vacaville was the official temperature, 15 miles from my home. The temperature on my front porch was 98. And the temperature in the house was 85. So that's the difference an enormous sycamore tree and other trees on my property make. plus the fact that I'm not surrounded by asphalt. So a real important thing for us to do as we're planning urban tree replacement is consider the canopy over hardscape surfaces. Put trees where people are, put trees where cars are. That's one of the most important things we can do, but also where people gather, close to the buildings, transportation hubs, places where people will be standing and waiting in a heat emergency that can be dangerous. With a shade tree, you can actually probably save lives if we continue to have these extreme heat episodes, as I suspect we will. This is a really simple quote, and I think it speaks to a key issue. Tree planting is cost effective. It mitigates urban heat islands, and it is considered essential. And that goes for your neighborhood. Your neighborhood is not just parking lots. There's streets, there's driveways, there's building surfaces that benefit from being shaded. I like this picture for two reasons. One, it does show a real benefit that trees have here. And remember, we do have rainfall years, high rainfall years, as we'll get into in a moment. It also shows a better model for tree roots than what most people visualize. Your average person visualizing tree root systems think they're kind of a mirror image of the top, but they're not, in fact, anything like that. Significant, almost 85, 90% of the roots of almost any tree are going to be in the top foot and a half or so of soil. It's rare, though not unheard of, for them to go much deeper in significant numbers. It's certainly beneficial for the tree if they do. But look at the area that this tree's roots occupy, and then think about how you're watering your existing trees. And you'll quickly realize why everybody's stopped watering their lawns. That's great. If you want to kill your lawn, that's fine. But there were tree roots under that lawn that were relying on the lawn watering. And this is why you don't think of them, because they go well past the canopy of the tree. Obviously, trees are best known for their improvement of air quality. The things they do specifically, the absorption of small particulate matter. If you live near the freeway, for example, trees are screening out a whole lot of the stuff coming off the freeway. One interesting study in this about ozone was where they tested the ozone levels under a tree canopy and then the ozone levels just outside that same tree's canopy. And they did this in a number of areas. And the average reduction of ozone directly under a tree was 20%. So what that tells you is that the big benefits health-wise of trees are directly related to where they are. They're local to the tree's placement in the landscape. So obviously, if you're designing a residential subdivision or you're planting a tree where groups of people gather, shading over them directly is going to be more effective for the health benefits. I didn't make this slide, but I think it's funny that we're looking at local economies and tourism and things like that. What trees really do is provide nesting sites, habitat, and not just for birds. They're extremely important as beneficial sources for bees and other pollinators, but also the kind of beneficial insects that come into your garden and control insects. They make nesting places for them to reproduce and multiply. So trees are part of your background of a healthy ecosystem. So people who move here are often a little startled by our climate because it's hot and dry in the summer, and they think that we don't have seasons here. I'm a Californian by birth and growing up here, so I'm one of that group that doesn't think we have seasons because it never snows or anything like that. But we do. We have distinct seasons. We're in a Mediterranean-style rainfall climate, which means cool, wet winters and dry summers. Most trees you can think of don't do very well if they aren't irrigated in the summertime. So that's an important consideration as you're choosing trees, is whether or not the site is going to be irrigated. A lot of people think our soils are all clay, but in fact they are not. They range from clay loam to sandy loam, and they're generally not limiting to tree growth at all. The official plant community here is Valley Grassland Plant Community. You would have walked through here 400 or 500 years ago, walking through bunch grasses, tule marshes down in the lower, poorer draining areas, and fairly widely spaced oaks with some riparian species along the creeks and so forth. That doesn't give us, unfortunately, and I have this conversation as a retailer very commonly, doesn't give us a lot of native trees to choose from because there aren't a lot of trees native to the Valley Grassland Plant Community, though there are some. 17 to 20 inches of annual rainfall, almost entirely November through February, although we've had a couple weird months in the last couple of years where we got more in October and September. Our average high temperature, June, July, August, is about 93 degrees, about 90 in September. And of course, we go above that. And there's many intervals, thank goodness, thanks to the Delta breeze and the coastal influence, where we're below that. And we get several frosty nights between November and February. This is our rainfall. I started recording this when we opened in 1981. So here's 40 years of rainfall data for the city of Davis, and it averages out to about 18 inches. There have been major flood events that many of you who have lived here for a long time will remember, including one as recently as January 2017. So drought is on everyone's mind, heat is on everyone's mind, but we also do still have flooding events. What I'm really looking at with this is the peaks and the valleys are getting more extreme. The high rainfall years, the low rainfall years, last year with 5-point-something inches of rainfall, very, very low. And we've had some very high 30-inch plus rainfall years as well. Average is about 18 to 18 and a half inches of rain. I did get a question before coming in about where the water comes from in the city of Davis now, because this is relevant to the choice of certain trees. If you go to the city's website, you'll actually see exactly where it comes from. They have this graphic that I pulled on the right, and in August, 83% was coming from surface water from the Sacramento River, a project that the voters approved about 12 years ago and has been bringing us surface water for 9 or 10 years, and about 17% from deeper wells. Last year, in 2021, we used well water, I believe, almost the entire year. Because of a Shasta critical designation by the state due to the drought emergency, we reverted to our deep aquifer wells. For many years, we got our water from those deep aquifers. Before that, we got them from some shallower wells. And you'll see 4 of those 25 wells are still in use as emergency backup, and the others remain available. So we actually have a surprisingly resilient water supply because we can go from surface water to deep well water. The question was, is the water quality changed? Well, when we get the surface water, yes. When we're getting well water, it's still got the high salt content and pH issues. But I've got to mention pH real quickly. They're keeping the pH, even of the surface water, at 8.1. So those of you familiar with acidity and alkalinity, they're adding sodium hydroxide to keep the water what it was before, which makes a lot of gardeners groan. But the reason for that is they don't want newer, cleaner water dissolving stuff out of the miles of iron pipes in Woodland and Davis and showing up in the water supply. So we still have a high pH, which may limit the choice of a few species. In the last 12 months alone, this is what climate change is all about, more extremes. We had almost 9 inches of rain a year ago in October on one single day. We broke temperature records earlier back in September. The total rainfall last year was the lowest since I moved here in the 1970s, with only 5.25 inches. And we had a high rainfall event in September 2022. So I do need to explain to new people to the area that our rainfall year goes from October 1 to September 30th, because that does reflect typically our rainfall pattern as a more accurate designation of what kind of a year it was. But it's going to be a weird year because 2021-22 shows 18.74 inches of rain, largely because of 12 inches in 2 storms, each of them out of season at either end of that season. So it really was a dry year, except for those 2 very pleasant but very anomalous rainstorms. And there are some pretty significant climate trends. We've had some flooding in December 2014, December 2019, when we got 6 inches of rain in a 2-day period. Late in May of 2000, Valley for a multi-decadal period. Could be a variety of reasons for that. Perhaps the loss of particulate matter in the air.
Don, we'd lost
Perhaps
you for
simply
just
that
a second there.
Okay, so the loss of valley fog has been notable. Anyone who's lived here for any amount of time is aware of it. It has some implications for tree crops. It might have some implications for other deciduous species. Another data point to the right there is concerning. These night temperatures are increasing, and night temperatures, well, we don't really know for sure impact they might have on deciduous species. There are species from colder climates that we would use here that might need a normal dormancy that might not be getting it. So down the road, 20, 30, 40 years, there may be species we're choosing now that turn out to be inappropriate. So we expect more rainfall and less rainfall. So those peaks and valleys are going to be more extreme. That really gets to a plant selection issue. When you're looking around Village Homes, Rancho Yellow, whatever neighborhood you're in, you need to look first at whether there's room for the tree and what tree might be appropriate. But the real question also is going to be, what's the long-term irrigation status of that site likely to be? Next to a soccer field or something like that, which we expect will stay in play field type usage, it'll be irrigated. But we're seeing a lot of turf coming out. and trees that needed it not doing well. And in point of fact, you can see the species that are being very adversely affected. In some cases, this is a mixed blessing. Caleriana pears, for example, have a lot of other problems, and they're also dying out from drought. We've lost dozens and dozens and dozens, and we'll probably lose more. The coast redwoods, though, unfortunately, of the 6 I've listed there, and the ash to some degree, but the coast redwoods especially, are an important part of our urban tree canopy. So we want to keep them alive if we can, and we want to find a replacement. When we get to the numbers, you'll see why. But here's what's happening. Those are your coast redwoods. Now, someone got this one on the left watered because I see a bit of new growth popping out there. The picture on the right was taken at the U.S. Post Office here in Davis back in 2014 when they decided to shut off the irrigation completely during that drought. And you can see the consequence. Those trees were dying from drought, then they got bacterial canker, and that was the end of it. And they're all gone now, which was a shame because they could have been kept alive as a new tree perhaps was planted to replace them. But this is happening to a lot of coast redwoods in Davis right now. So real quickly, replacement possibilities for coast redwood. I had thought of incense cedar since it's native, not here, but further down in the valley towards the foothills. Somewhat more drought tolerant, not looking real good this summer though. So I think that'll be a sort of a maybe recommendation. But I can say that 2 non-native conifers, Deodar cedar, that picture is a tree that I planted 35 years ago. It has been unirrigated now for 5 or 6 years. And Atlas cedar to the right, that tree is also about 30 years old and has been unirrigated for the last 5 or 10 years. So these are non-native cedars that are drought tolerant that might fill that niche that the coast redwood was occupying. So it's important to know the signs of drought stress. And these are leaves that have been burnt 2 to 3 times due to episodes of drought. That's a linden, which is not a particularly drought tolerant tree. On the right, these are Chinese hackberries that were unirrigated through an entire summer and were defoliated by midsummer. So the question then is that really going to hurt the tree? Well, yes, because late in the summer, early fall, they would be manufacturing food to store in the roots and the stem, and those trees are going to leaf out more poorly in the spring, probably won't leaf out fully to the end. Weaker branches may start to come down. So it is a threat to the integrity of the tree and the long-term stability. Customer sent me the picture on the left after 116-degree temperatures. That bay tree looked fine before then, so it was just toasted literally on the west side of the trunk. So direct sunburn from high temperature episodes is a concern. On the right, you can see why this is a concern. That's a linden that had a sunburn episode over a decade ago. And while it's healing, forming reaction wood, that damage is more or less permanent, and that tree's long-term health is probably in question. So the drought tolerance of different conditions, the needs of different sites. Residential landscaping is different than commercial landscaping. Reduced irrigation on municipal properties. We need a whole list of trees for a range of irrigation conditions, from never getting watered again after they're established to planted next to a lawn that who knows how it's getting watered. The oaks we're planting on Russell Boulevard, we're hand watering. Once they're done, we're done hand watering them, they're on their own. By comparison, tree in a lawn, the biggest issue is likely to be insufficient depth of watering and too shallow and keeping it damp around the crown. So quite a spectrum of conditions under which trees will be planted. I do want to mention freeze episodes because they do occur. People move here from Southern California, as I did, and they want to plant, I don't know, jacarandas or something because they remember them and love them. And in 1990 and 1998, we lost a number of species actually to severe freeze damage. The first freeze, 1990, 16 degrees was the low temperature, did significant damage. People replanted some of those species, like Australian willow is a good example. 1998, they froze again. So let's just say ethical nursery professionals stopped selling those in Northern California, but it will happen again. When I mention freeze, people often say, oh, well, that won't be happening again. Unfortunately, it's the peaks and the valleys. And while the long-term trend is obviously in one direction, we still will have freeze events, just as we've had more recently in 2015. And then the heat episode we just went through is probably going to take out a number of trees that were already stressed. So tolerance for flooding, tolerance for irrigation is, why would we be concerned about that? Because generally speaking, we have soils that are dense. It's a valley with finer textured soils, which means they hold soils. And so when they hold moisture, So when there's excess moisture from rainfall or irrigation, the root systems can become anaerobic, or worse, if it's constant irrigation right near the crown during high temperature periods, Phytophthora cinnamomi, which we call crown and root rot, can attack. And I expect, I've already seen cases of it from the heat episode 3 or 4 weeks ago. People are using drip irrigation. They're running it daily. And that's anathema to trees, is to have that daily trickle of moisture right next to the trunk during high temperature periods. Also, if you happen to be joining us from, let's say, the cannery or newer neighborhoods where you had very disturbed landscape settings, compacted soil, asphalt that may or may not have been removed, more asphalt and concrete being put in, loss of rainfall infiltrating, loss of poor gas exchange, roots won't grow into dry soil. Soil that's covered with asphalt and concrete is dry, so roots simply won't penetrate there. And trees that are already there will be adversely affected for sure. And new trees need to have their root zones planned for. Permeable pavers are a good example of a way to mitigate that in an existing landscape or where you want bigger trees. And invasive species is a concern. Bradford pear was widely planted 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's become very invasive in the eastern United States. Not so much here, not listed as invasive in California, but has the potential to become so. So lists need to be updated with new understanding of invasive species. So where do we stand right now? Well, our urban forest actually, with a recent survey, has pretty good species diversity. We've got good canopy coverage in older neighborhoods. We do have a concern about, as I mentioned, older cohorts or groups of trees aging. We got a lot of people not watering anymore. At one point, I spoke to a city staffer who said, City of Davis, a couple droughts ago, had gone from 13 million gallons a day to 10 million gallons a day. That's really good, except that's 3 million gallons of water a day that weren't getting to some trees. So obviously it was having some impact on some of the species. And some particular neighborhoods of concern, I've mentioned Village Homes has one species that's aging out, so a lack of species diversity is a real problem. The 10-20-30 rule. This is an old picture of American elms lining a street, and this is the look people think about when they're planting urban trees. Unfortunately, if you do this, you've got one species all the way down. And this picture, if you look at the car models there, and you know your cars, we think was taken probably in the 1970s. And I would guess all of those elms are now gone. Had there been some plane trees, some oaks, some other tree species in there, they wouldn't have lost the whole canopy. So a good rule is no more than 10% of one species or variety. No more than 20% from one genus, Quercus, oaks, for example. No more than 30% from one family. Elms and Zelkovas are in the same family. So you just look around. Now that's the look around rule is actually a pretty good one. Look around. You got a lot of one species. Time to start thinking about planting something else to broaden the species diversity. You can measure it by how many of each one are in the ground or what we call their importance value. And you can see, if you look at these lists, a couple of species that dominate. And the importance value reflects how much of the city, these are the city's trees themselves, not the ones in your backyard, how much of the city's canopy is invested in 4 or 5 species. And that London plane tree, if you know your botanical names, Platanus acerifolia, it's a really important tree. Part of that is it was heavily planted in the early 20th century, so they're big trees. Part of that is it's very popular because it's a great urban tree for its tolerance of pollution. Quercus lobata, our valley oak, is a native species here, so that's great. Number 3, coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens. So that's a real concern. Pistache, Chinese pistache, Pistachia chinensis is a very good choice, but we now have a lot of them. So that's worth just keeping in the back of your mind as you're choosing trees. And I'll stop with Chinese hackberry. Was a great choice until the Asian woolly hackberry aphid showed up about 15, 20 years ago. Now they all drip this disagreeable sticky stuff all over the ground underneath them. Nuisance pests are called nuisance pests, but they are life-threatening because the greatest threat to a tree that has aphids in that kind of numbers is someone with a chainsaw. So this is a measure of the relative performance index, and really what it shows us is that some species are fading out or having problems and should be considered for replacing from our tree program, or it may simply reflect their age in the case of the London plane trees. But we do have certain species really dominating our urban canopy, which is typical. That's been the story of urban forestry forever. 1 or 2 species really catch on and get used heavily, and then you have a problem like with the elms, as with ash, and so on. So you can see why they're popular. You know, Chinese pistache on the left there, valley oak on the right. That's our native oak. That's a 20-year-old tree. People often want to plant them. And as a retailer, I do suggest you consider you're planting a tree that will get 60 feet plus, 40 foot or more broad. So make sure that it has sufficient space. I do want to mention these two because people ask about them. They're unusual for Davis. A fairly high number of trees in our urban canopy are cork oaks. Dr. Milton Hildebrand, shown here in this picture about 10 years ago, he planted that cork oak in 1949. There was a big spate of cork oak planting in Northern California, Chico and Davis in particular, concerned about the wine cork industry and also the fact that they're extremely well adapted here. They're from Portugal, and it has a very similar heat and rainfall climate. And then the Canary Island pine, I don't know why, but a whole lot of them were planted in Davis in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. This tree that I'm showing on the right here is on my farm, completely unirrigated for over a decade. So obviously very well adapted to our climate. Trees can live for many, many years. Many of the trees you're looking at, maybe 80 years or more old. In College Park, that neighborhood is hitting 100 years. Some of the trees are still with us from the original plantings, but it really is a number of factors, including, as I like to say, a little bit of luck. The longest lived trees in the world tend to be the ones planted in cemeteries. Where they are with respect to hardscape, traffic, people doing things, driving and using heavy equipment, obviously is a big factor. But a biggest factor in my observation seems to be the amount of soil area that each tree has to live out its life. So I see trees planted in parking lots in 10 by 10 areas that are never going to get more than 20 by 20. But if you want a big tree, you need to give it lots of room. It doesn't have to be right under the tree. It can be adjoining areas, but irrigated areas or where rainfall can settle into the soil needs to be a pretty good size. And there's lots of research on this. So the soil volume for trees is well understood. Give them enough, not just for the canopy, but past the canopy. Mulching is very helpful. Landscaping can make a big difference. But this is one of the key principles we want to get at in the other parts of this program, which is the importance of diversity. You just need to keep testing. We need to keep testing at Tree Davis. Research scientists need to keep testing and trying trees. And it takes 10 or 20 years of investment before you see whether it's really going to work. And so we need to keep changing the populations of trees around the city of Davis and other areas where you might be listening. The biggest problem is host-specific pests and diseases. And particularly things that kill, what that means is things that attack or kill or are a nuisance on one species. Asian woolly hackberry aphid only attacks Chinese hackberry. It doesn't attack European or common hackberry, but there's a lot of Chinese hackberries around. So to avoid that impact, it would have been better 60 years ago if they had planted a mix of hackberry species instead of just the one. And probably the best examples in the news right now, emerald ash borer, which is hitting all over the East Coast and is now well established in Oregon. But we've had them in Davis. We've had pest problems, I should say, that are specific in Davis. The clearwing moth took out all the white alders on Arthur Street back in the 80s. And there are other pest problems here in California that we need to be aware of. Sudden oak death seems to be confined to the coastal fog belt, thank goodness, because it's killing a lot of native oaks. But down in Southern California, Polyphagus shothole borer is hitting a lot of different species. And so we're very concerned about that. Here's the current spread of the emerald ash borer. Everywhere it's established, it's killing all the ash trees. Ash trees make up, 10-15% of our tree canopy here. So we need to start planning now for the ultimate there's almost no question it's going to happen, invasion of California by emerald ash borers beginning to kill the Modesto ash, moraine ash, raywood ash that are scattered about here in Davis and Sacramento. So that's a white alder on the side, the last one on Arthur Drive that I took a picture of. And within 10 years, that was all down Arthur off of Russell. All the way down was California white alder. They're all completely gone within a decade because the borer came in, then they had to replant them. They chose London plane trees to replace them. So for about a 15-year period, Arthur Drive was without tree canopy because of a particular host-specific pest. The biggest obstacles have to do with species. I think I've emphasized that. Enough soil volume, planting properly, which you can find great information about at the Tree Davis website, irrigation to establishment, and proper aftercare. As I mentioned before, the soils in our area are not a problem. You'll often read about constructed soils or raised beds or things like that. We generally don't have any issues locally with our soils. Now, people who are joining us from other parts of Sacramento, you might have an actual hard pan. You need to test your infiltration rate so you know how to water, but you don't generally have a concern, particularly in the two neighborhoods in question. It's heavy soil, it holds water well. If you water slowly, it'll work. You may have a site where you want to plant a tree that needs to be broken up because of previous uses, but other than that, we don't typically have to do anything. And we never, ever amend the planting hole at the time of planting a tree. We have decades of research now showing it's not only unnecessary, it's actually counterproductive. This is one of the biggest issues I want you all to take home with you, is that the follow-up care is what really matters. Just putting a tree in the ground and hoping for the best, you have a very high mortality rate. It's the watering and training and mulching in the first few years, first couple of years especially, expanding the irrigation outward if it's a species that needs that. And you all, as tree stewards, should adopt trees for their early years. You can certainly help Tree Davis and the city of Davis to get them established. And let's not do these things, okay? This is that tree, by the way, on the left is still there. It's now dead. And I don't know whatever happened to the poor thing on the right. So when we plant a new tree, we raise them tough. We water each tree 10 to 15 gallons every 2 weeks. And we continue that through about 3 irrigation seasons, and then they're on their own. My own experience on a farm with new trees is I do better if I give them that 10 to 15 gallons every week. But every 2 weeks is working. You look at those oaks on Russell Boulevard, that's what they're getting. Water should spread out because roots won't grow into dry soil, so it needs to go outward and down so the roots can progress outward. And this is really important. An irrigated landscape of compatible plants will actually naturally encourage the tree's root development. You'll be watering further out. You'll get roots in there. You'll get things that will create a healthy living soil. So the combination of landscaping, not to crowd the tree, but landscaping with things that are compatible with it and irrigating them will actually make a healthier environment for all of us as well as the trees. And I do want to say that, watering young trees, I've no customers and friends of Tree Davis who just go out and do that for us. Well, one of our tree steward award winners last year takes 2 5-gallon buckets of water once a week and pours it on one of the trees we planted. That's all he did, but it got those trees established. So in bigger trees, you want to water deeper, 18 inches deep and out past the canopy of the tree. I emphasized that earlier. Just want you to reiterate this, that the root system goes out more than it goes down. So you want to water the whole root zone, whether sprinklers, drip, whatever method you prefer to use. Make sure you're watering long enough. It's a detailed discussion, so that's all I'm going to say, to get an 18-inch soil depth of irrigation. 18-inch screwdriver, by the way, can be your best friend for assessing whether you've done that. Go out the next day, push it in the ground. When it gets hard to push, you haven't watered deep enough. And aging trees, if you're in a neighborhood that has a lot of them, it's a very specific issue, probably worth a whole webinar in itself, but they should be managed by professional arborists. You may need to augment the irrigation, but you should ask. Don't just assume it because some tree species would not be appropriate. Be aware that the roots are everywhere. And if you make a change around an old established tree, you can kill it. It's that simple. So make sure you don't affect the drainage, make sure you don't radically change the irrigation, and so on. So our absolute goal is to get a mix of species. We want them in our current situation and years from now when it's much hotter at times and when it's drier sometimes and when we have these epic floods that are projected to happen here as well. So we do use native species when we can. We also look to the American Southwest, other parts of the world such as South Africa, Australia, parts of Latin America that have similar rainfall patterns and similar temperature ranges. So we're going to want to make a species list, a very broad species list that includes as many natives and plants from Texas and Arizona and Portugal and you name it, so we can keep testing things that'll take greater high temperature episodes and more incidences of drought. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. McPherson for one of the important things that Tree Davis is doing with respect to evaluating trees for present and future use around Davis and other areas. Let's make sure.
There we go.
Here we are.
Were you going to take questions or?
This would be a good opportunity for a few minutes of questions if they've, if the host, if the tech folks have any coming in to ask us.
I think we have one question, but I think we should save it to the end. It's not really specific to your presentation so far, or to one of your other planned timings, and let Greg go first, and then it might be appropriate a little bit later.
Okay.
Okay, I will get started. Thank you all for taking time from your busy schedules to join us today, and a shout out to Cool Davis for all the things they do to keep Davis cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Tree Davis and then our Climate Ready Tree Research Program. And Tree Davis just turned 30. We had our 30th birthday this year. So we're mature, but we're not quite over the hill. We, over the past 30 years, planted over 12,000 trees and engaged thousands of volunteers to make that happen. And really all our work happens through these partnerships that we have with cities and agencies in this region. So we have 4 programs. One of them is Community Canopy. That's been a grant program. We're wrapping up the planting of 1,000 trees in the city of Davis. There's still a few trees left if you really need a tree bad. And all these trees are in public spaces and in front of homes or in parks. We just got a new grant from CAL FIRE, an urban forestry education grant, and that's a 4-year program that is going to engage high school students in Davis and West Sacramento, and through lectures and hands-on experiences, exposure to different careers in urban forestry and arboriculture. It's going to show them different pathways for them to pursue this field. We have Memorial and Tribute Tree Program, and this is where trees are planted to honor loved ones. Tribute trees are planted in green spaces, and memorial trees in our Memorial Tree Grove, which is just off Shasta Drive, south of University Retirement Community. And we have a place where plaques are located to help as a remembrance. And then finally, we have a new program called Climate Ready Landscapes, and we're branching out from trees to a broader view of the landscape that incorporates native plants in the understory, as well as climate ready tree species. And Emily's going to talk a little bit more about this. We have some demonstrations in the Memorial Tree Grove. And you can see we have the first grove was the Wolk Grove, and you can see Lois Wolk and her family. So we would love to welcome you to join us in making Davis cleaner, greener, and a cooler place to live. So we get our work done by working with volunteers. So you can go to our website, volunteer just about every weekend during the rainy season. We have planting events and mulching and watering. We're always looking for good new board members, so that's an opportunity. And we have an annual Fall Legacy event, which is Saturday, November 19th from 10 to 12 this year at the Tree Davis Memorial Grove. We would love to have you join us. And it's just kind of a tree love-in for anyone who loves and cares about trees. And finally, there are opportunities to donate to Tree Davis. You can name a grove right now in our Memorial Grove, or you can think of us on Giving Tuesday, which is November 29th. We are cooperating with the city of Davis on the Urban Forest Management Plan, which Don alluded to. This is from the City of Davis website. So we would love to hear from you. And if you have concerns about the trees around you, the trees in your neighborhood, the trees downtown, too many, too few, wrong species, whatever, you can go to this website or enter your information and contact Davey Resource Group, which is the contractor that's doing this plan. But this is really important in establishing a vision for the future of our urban forest. And as part of that, we are sponsoring a photo contest where you can win some Tree Davis swag. If you have a really good local picture of a tree this isn't the banyan tree from your trip to Hawaii. It has to be a local tree. So you can go to the website and submit your photo. We appreciate that. And finally, John mentioned one of our tree stewards. So every year at the Legacy event, we want to honor and recognize people who are going above and beyond in terms of their care and love for our trees. So if you know an organization or an individual who you feel is merits this kind of recognition, we would love to get information on that. You can go to our website, treedavis.org, and submit their name to be nominated. All right, so the last part of my talk is about our Climate Ready Tree program. And this really began, I moved to Davis about 30 years ago, and I was in Tucson, Arizona, and taught plant materials and landscape architecture at the University of Arizona. Moved to Davis, and I was a little shocked at how hot and dry it was, but nothing quite as bad as 112 degrees in Tucson until the summer. And it was 112 and it felt just as hot as it was in Tucson. So I began thinking, well, maybe some of those trees in Tucson that are really well adapted to hot, arid conditions might do well here in Davis. And so through some contacts with Mountain States Nursery in Phoenix, they sent an 18-wheeler loaded with trees in 1999, so about 23 years ago. And there were 7 species of trees, which you see on the right here, 6 of each. And we planted those around town and in Sacramento. So we've had about 23 years to evaluate these trees. And really, they've all done pretty darn well, except the Palo Verde, which the root system just could not keep up with the top. And the top grew so lush and luxuriant that it would blow over when the winds did it. It acted just like a sail, and the roots would come up out of the ground. So yeah, so the different soils make a difference, but I have a little time sequence here that's kind of interesting. This is a Texas red oak, 5 years after it was planted in front of my home. And you can see it's already 20 feet. So it's really a myth to think that oaks are really slow growing, because this one was not. And beautiful fall color. So here it is 12 years after it was planted, and you can see how the trunk has gotten quite a bit bigger. The crown is filled out. And this is 17 years after planting. And here it is today. So 23 years. So, you know, this is kind of the beginning of learning about how do these trees adapt to our climate and to our soils, and what will work and what won't work here. So in 2015, we got a grant for a more formal study. And kind of took it to the next level. And I had the pleasure working with Natalie Van Dorn, Erica Teach, Allison Berry at UC Davis, and some cooperators from UC Cooperative Extension. And we got more trees, 12 different species of trees, and 12 of each for this study. And of course, the bigger goal is to create a more resilient urban forest by shifting the palette of tree species from the lindens and the pears and the maples that Don referred to species that are going to tolerate the aridification that we're experiencing in our climate. So it's a 20-year study, began in 2015. It's actually in 3 climate zones, not only the Inland Valley, but the Inland Empire and Southern California coast. And we ran some of the climate models to project what future climate would be. And then we consulted with experts and tried to identify what species would be most likely to survive the exposures that we will be experiencing in the future. And so some of the things we looked at were, what is the native habitat of the species and what type of soil conditions does it live in, kind of sunlight exposure, what's its tolerance in its native environment to drought, wind, salt, and cold, and is it invasive or will it be invasive, and how vulnerable is it to pests and disease threats. So we ended up with kind of a numerical ranking, and we had to, of course, be able to find the trees to test them. So availability was a big issue. But some of the species are in all 3 climate zones. Some are just in a single climate zone. And the experimental design involved planting in 4 different park sites in each climate zone. So there are 4 parks in Sacramento where we planted 2 in each park, 2 of each of the species, 2 of each of the 12 species, so 24 at each park. And then we have a reference site that's just west of 113 on Hutchison, where we have 4 individuals of each of the 12 species. And so this is just looking at the survival over the first 5 years of establishment. And the blue boxes highlight the species that are most successful. So the shoestring acacia, the thornless mesquite, and Canby's oak had 100% survival in both the park and the reference site. The desert willow and the Osage orange, it's a thornless, fruitless Osage orange, have done pretty well as well. So it's early, there's only 5 years of data, but we're beginning to get some indication of what's working and what isn't. And Emily is going to provide more information on the performance of these trees as well. So I will end with that. And this is a website where you can get more information on the Climate Ready Tree Program. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Emily in a moment here. What Greg has pointed out is the importance of continuing, obviously, let me get my screen up here correctly, continuing to research and evaluate trees, because we need more species in the system, in the works. I mean, there's a lot of very familiar tree species, such as the London plane and the Chinese pistache. I need to click the right button here. There we go. And we've got a lot of these. So 10 or 20% of our canopy is composed of London plane trees. So we want alternatives to those. Hold on here. There we go. Thank you. The Chinese pistache continues to be popular. There's no disease or pest problems threatening it, but it's a big number in our canopy. So it's fine to plant them, but we should also look for alternatives that give the same benefits. Elms are coming back. They all died out over many years, but new hybrids have been created that are proving to be very good urban trees. Well, crepe myrtles, I don't know how many tens of thousands of crepe myrtles there are. They're a significant part of our canopy in spite of being a smaller tree, and that's all fine, except for the crepe myrtle aphid, which is now well established in the Sacramento Valley, causes sticky drip under them. So it's hard to manage, and we need some alternatives for that, such as smoke tree or some other options. Most other flowering trees that I sell as a nursery owner aren't very drought tolerant. They're garden trees. So they're not really going to be considered for this kind of resident landscape where it's going to be over pavement or something like that, unless it's going to always be irrigated. But there are some trees, smoke bush, pomegranates, things like that, that are quite heat and drought tolerant. Some maples have better drought tolerance than others. So that's worth considering when you're looking for that particular look. And our native trees, we don't have a lot to choose from, as I mentioned before. The valley oak, the blue oak, western sycamore, very prone to anthracnose. Black walnuts aren't going to be very popular in a lot of settings. Then the smaller trees, I have a Fremont cottonwood on my property. It's 50 feet tall in 15 years, and its roots are everywhere. So it's a rural tree only. But this continued evaluation is what's really important. And there is the test series that Greg is talking about, and an elm trial that's happening here at UC Davis. We're evaluating many of these new hybrid disease-resistant elms, which could return to our urban landscapes. So one thing we have observed obviously, is not just the aftercare, but how you plant around them. What you do with respect to the tree's entire environment makes a big difference in the success rate of the trees. And so, as mentioned, Tree Davis is doing climate-ready landscaping, which you can see examples of out at Arroyo Park and others, where we're planting things, watering them correctly, and they'll be a much lower water use, but they'll help the trees get established as well. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to the Director of Gateways Horticulture and Teaching Gardens at the UC Davis Arboretum and President of the Board of Directors of Central Park Gardens, Emily Griswold.
Thank you very much, Don. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. Can you all see my screen? Okay, great. Yeah, so the big question right now is what tree should I plant? And historically, 20th century horticulture was all about, oh, well, let's look at what has done well in the past here and plant more of those. Well, 21st century horticulture is a whole different deal, because past performance is no longer an indicator of future success, because our climate is basically changing right before our eyes. And we have, I think there's always been the issue of emerging pests and diseases, but the stresses are exacerbated with climate change. So really, we need to be looking not just at our current climate and what will survive in our current climate, but because of the longevity of trees, we need to be considering our future climate as well. And one thing that I have been acutely aware of is that our region lacks an up-to-date recommended tree list with climate change really in mind. And so Greg talked about his wonderful research on climate-ready trees. So that is great work. I've also been working on a project to trial 40 different species collected from Texas for their performance as urban trees in the Sacramento Valley. And we're just getting that going in the Arboretum. But those little baby trees are just 3 years old, started from seed. So they're just still in the seedling to sapling stage of development. It's a little premature to say, yes, stamp of approval, this is a great tree. So as we trial these new species, we will be getting more information. And so in terms of thinking about what trees are best for our region, there isn't, I don't think, ever going to be a point where there's just a static list of these are the best trees and you can, bet your bottom dollar that this is going to be a great tree well into the future. So we're living in a time of uncertainty, and so we're trying to gather all the information that we can. And you could probably relate to, from a business standpoint for nurseries, they are responding to what do people want to buy. And so there's a lag between kind of this research and what is being identified as the best trees for the future and what is actually available in nurseries. And so one of the challenges that we have right now is that the main trees that are still in production are really our 20th century landscape trees, not 21st century landscape trees. And so that's something that Tree Davis is working quite actively on, is trying to figure out how do we get some good lists of promising trees for the future, and then also work with nurseries to get those into production so people can actually acquire them. One of the resources that I have been quite inspired by is in Albuquerque, they did a comprehensive kind of citywide climate-ready tree list development process, and it was actually inspired by Greg McPherson's team's work on climate-ready trees here in California. But they took it a step further in terms of developing a big list of recommended trees for that region. And this is just an example of the type of resource that they have now in Albuquerque for different types of planting landscape settings in that region. And so this is an area that we're just actually, Tree Davis is initiating, bringing together partners from the university, from the city, from CAL FIRE, looking at Northern California, hoping to involve some folks perhaps from Sacramento and Woodland in really assessing what are the trees that we're most comfortable recommending for the future. So we hope to have a resource like this coming soon. I don't hold your breath. It's going to take some time, but working towards this kind of resource. I would love to have this for you all now, but this is just like a little glimpse of kind of the data that needs to be crunched to look at trees. What, you know, we've talked about all these different, both Dawn and Greg have talked about critical factors in selecting urban trees. And so kind of scouring through data, getting information from folks who are really knowledgeable about trees and their performance here. There's a ton of information to sift through to come up with what we think is going to be the best for the future. So in the meantime, we still have places where we want to plant trees, and we don't want to be sitting on our hands like, oh, I can't plant a tree because I don't know what's going to be the best thing. Like, the best time to plant a tree is like at least 5 years ago, maybe when you were born. So we want to keep planting trees. And so what can we do right now? And I am a native plant lover. I'm a native oak lover. People who know me know that I am just like an oak obsessed person. So there will be a heavily oak weighted set of recommendations here. But our native oaks, valley oak and blue oak, are two excellent choices if you want to support habitat in our urban areas. These are both premier habitat trees. Valley oaks grow faster and grow larger. Blue oaks are extremely drought tolerant. So if there's a site that has no irrigation, I've noticed just in my neighborhood, places where there's basically, you know, kind of abandonment of the landscape, the blue oak tree, the little baby blue oak tree is still growing. It can persist through hardship. So it grows more slowly, but is incredibly tough and provides habitat for a variety of insects, birds, native wildlife, which is critical for urban ecosystems. So I always start with that, but we can't have our entire urban forest be native oaks. As much as I love them, that would put us in a place of vulnerability if there, you know, God forbid, if there was ever a major pest and disease that came through that impacted our oaks, our forest would be decimated. So we need to put our eggs in multiple baskets and really focus on diversity. And so what are some trees that would be a good replacement, say, for a crepe myrtle? Because we can't also put crepe myrtles everywhere. So one tree species that Greg mentioned that has performed quite well is, and is largely proven, is the desert willow. And there are seedless forms. Bubba is a variety that Tree Davis is planting quite a bit. There's a variety called Majestic Beauty that we've planted in the Arboretum that is performing very well. It's satisfying long season of flowers through the summer, attracts hummingbirds, and is a pretty fast growing small tree. Greg also mentioned the thornless mesquite as being a very successful tree in this area. So this is more of a desert species. Its natural form is to grow more horizontally, so it does need training to get it into a more upright habit. So what Greg and I have been working on is thinking about what are the trees that we're more confident about recommending. So that's this largely proven category. What are things that are somewhat proven that could be planted maybe in, you know, smaller numbers? You might want to experiment with it in your yard, but might not line a street with it. And then what are some things that are promising but unproven? Maybe they've only, you know, we have one or two in the Arboretum that are doing well, and we want to try them in more places. So the shoestring acacia, Greg mentioned as one of the climate ready trees that has had good survival. Related to our Western redbud is the Oklahoma redbud. It has actually kind of more intensely colored flowers that are a bit larger than the Western redbud, and it is actually suitable to training as a single trunk form, whereas the Western redbud really likes to be multi-trunked. At the Arboretum and the gazebo, I have been really pleased with the Mexican olive, Cordia boissieri. It is native to South Texas and Mexico and has these beautiful white flowers through the heat of the summer. 115 degrees, that thing is still blooming and looking lovely. And then another super toughie is the Texas mountain laurel, Dermatophyllum secundiflorum, also was formerly known as Sephora secundiflora. It has clusters of wisteria-like purple flowers that bloom in the early spring and smell kind of like grape soda. And it is quite slow growing, but good things come to those who wait, and it is extremely tough. So those were some small trees. Some medium tree examples. Red Push Pistache, as Greg mentioned, has been doing really well for well over 20 years in trials in Davis. And then through the elm trials that have been happening on campus, the Triumph elm has performed well and is a bit smaller than the really big elms that you may be familiar with. So it's a medium-sized elm. And that is one that we can recommend with confidence. The Osage orange, so this is one, it has kind of an unusual form. It's a very oddball tree. It doesn't have any close relatives that we typically plant. So Maclura pomifera, the Osage orange, has been traditionally used in hedgerows across the central and western United States. Incredibly tough tree, and still has green glossy leaves even through pretty extreme drought conditions. And then on the promising side, these are some things that aren't really available yet, but we have been testing in the Arboretum. They're part of my Texas Tree Trials project that I've been working on. So the Lacey oak is native to the Texas Hill Country and has kind of bluish foliage and nice kind of pink fall color. And then the Western soapberry is called soapberry because there are saponins in the berries that you can make to make a little lather. But it has leaves almost like a little bit like a walnut tree and has performed quite well in desert cities, like at the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum in Tucson. There's a lovely specimen of it, and it seems quite adaptable. So I'm excited to see how those do in our trials. And then for large trees, the Texas red oak has been, there's of course Greg's famous tree in his front yard, which is a local landmark. And it has also been widely planted on the UC Davis campus and has been performing quite well there. One thing to note is if it is planted in a landscape with regular irrigation, the acorns will sprout. So that is something that you will need to manage is seedlings of that. Another one that has been part of climate ready tree trials and has performed quite well in this area is the Texas live oak, Quercus fusiformis. It is closely related to the southern live oak, Quercus virginiana. It is easier to find southern live oak in the nursery trade. So, and southern live oak is also quite drought tolerant. So both of those, I would say, are good, reliable choices for heat and drought. The Canby's oak is something that has just been, hasn't been planted in large numbers yet in the valley, but the ones that have been in the climate ready tree trials have been performing well, and it seems quite promising. And then a couple promising trees from the Arboretum. We have several Guadalupe Island cypress that have done quite well for a long time in the Arboretum. So as we're looking for conifers to replace redwoods, this is a drought tolerant tree that in the places where it's growing has survived without irrigation for long periods. Another one is the Montezuma cypress, which is kind of a little bit of a surprise because it is closely related to the swamp cypress of the southeastern United States. So it's basically a Mexican relative of that. It can survive flooding, which, that is something we need to contend with as well, but it is also quite drought tolerant. So this individual doesn't necessarily have the most shapely form, but this is one that is growing behind the Arboretum headquarters near a horse corral there and has had no irrigation for at least, I would say, 20 years, and looks remarkably good through the summer with no irrigation. So those are just some trees that I'm excited about that I wanted to share with you all. And I thought this might be a time to have a few questions. And Dawn, maybe you wanted to talk about availability notes.
Yeah, availability is an issue. I mean, I am a retail nursery owner, and in Northern California, a number of these trees that have been mentioned are not yet presently available. Wholesale nursery growers are conservative with a small C sense. There are still nursery growers I order from who are growing aristocrat pears and Leylandii cypresses, even though we stopped recommending them 30 years ago. Bringing in a new species is a big challenge, but an example would be the red push pistache, which is an interspecific hybrid. It'd be great to get more of them in the landscape, similar to the Keith Davey pistache that many of us are selling. One of the growers I work with suddenly has some on his list for next year. And I said, oh, that's great. And his reply was, yeah, what is this tree? Tell me more about it. So a big part of our educational component is going to be reaching out to growers, the small growers that provide and the intermediate sized growers that provide trees to nurseries and hardware chains, especially around Northern California. So some of these will become available to you. I can mention Oklahoma redbud. Almost any nursery can get that. Desert willows are becoming increasingly available. With respect to the red oak, there are other red oaks like Quercus shumardi, which I've been selling for years and have personal experience with as being reasonably drought tolerant. I'd love to see the Texas red oak show up on lists. So don't drive around to nurseries looking for all of these individual trees that we mentioned. You're probably still going to be making some selections from the original common ones that are used in the area. Just please keep in the back of your mind those ones that we're using a lot of, like the London plane tree. It checks a lot of boxes and so on, but it is 20% of our canopy or something close to that. Chinese pistache, many, many advantages, but we're getting up there in terms of the numbers. That doesn't mean Village Homes doesn't plant any Chinese pistache when they do their replacement of the Chinese tallow. It means 10%. Or no more than 10% of the replacement trees. And that's really what we're getting at, is try some new things, try some proof.
Uh-oh, Dawn.
Yeah, Emily, you want to take a few
Available
questions?
and make this from available.
Hi, Don. We lost you for just a second there.
Okay, I think I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So we could go ahead and take some questions. I see a couple have shown up in the chat there. Chris, do you want to handle the questions for now? And we'll
Sure. Maybe specifically to Emily, while you were talking, Anna was asking about what rate do those large trees that you were talking grow? Are they fast or slow growth?
So some of that goes into like how much do you water it to push the growth. So there's a certain amount you can water to keep a plant alive. But if you want it to thrive and grow rapidly, deep irrigation and not allowing the plant to go into stress mode will accelerate its growth. And so with on campus, with like new construction projects, there are, specific irrigation systems installed to water the trees when they're young. And so there are these bubblers that basically provide deep water for the trees. And what we're seeing is the trees can grow at least 3 feet a year when they're getting, kind of regular deep water to get them going.
Okay, Rachel just asked, do you have any recommended small, medium, and large evergreen trees?
Mm-hmm. Emily.
So the Texas mountain laurel is an evergreen tree. So that's an example. Another one that I didn't mention is the strawberry tree, Arbutus unido. So it is a fairly slow growing tree, but that's a Mediterranean species that there are some amazing old specimens on campus and in town. So it can ultimately get 20, 25 feet tall and is really a beautiful tree. It does produce, fruits, fleshy fruits. So they can make a little bit of a mess when they're dropping. I'm one of those people, like, I love trees. I'm okay with a bit of mess to have like a happy, thriving, drought tolerant tree. There's also the Marina madrone, which is a hybrid madrone, and that is commonly available at nurseries, and it's an Arboretum all-star plant that we've been recommending for years. I think probably Unido is a bit more drought tolerant than Marina. Marina has a bigger leaf, so generally plants that have smaller leaves, plants that have silver leaves are going to be, plants that have thick evergreen leaves, they are going to be more drought tolerant than plants that have larger leaves.
So Emily, are some of the oaks that you've mentioned evergreen as opposed to, or live oaks instead of deciduous?
Yeah, so the Texas live oak that I mentioned is an evergreen tree. And I didn't have a picture of it, but it looks very similar. The southern live oak is also an evergreen tree. We do have our native coast live oak that does really well here as well. So there's an issue. Cork oaks also do great here. There's an issue in terms of plant quality, and when you have a tree that starts out root bound because of how it was produced in a nursery, my sense is that coast live oaks and cork oaks in particular, they have a hard time kind of getting over that. Whereas the southern live oak, it can actually root graft more easily. And I had this experience going to Huntington Gardens down in Southern California. It's beautiful public garden. They had placed some big 24-inch box southern live oaks in their landscape as kind of like temporary filler. They didn't even plant them. They just put the boxes on the ground and they didn't move them. And the roots grew, and then the trees got big. And so the tree is like up in the air, the box has fallen away, and the tree is still doing great. So in terms of so that southern live oak is a tree that can overcome all kinds of obstacles in terms of horticultural mistreatment. So there's something to be said for that. It's also more tolerant of summer irrigation. So, but it tolerates drought. So it's a very resilient tree. I always prefer a native tree for the habitat value. Coast live oak would be better for a habitat value, but with something like that, I would start with a small one. Like ideally you start with an acorn that a jay has planted. If there's one in your yard that is already growing, that's in a good place, like that's your best bet for a cork oak or for a coast live oak.
Thanks, Emily. We do have two questions from John Reuter that are more sort of policy oriented.
Okay.
One has to do with current policy development related to balancing the interests of solar and trees and parking lots. And then the second one is asking your opinion on the downtown plan is going through its sort of final process with the city. And what's your opinion of the downtown tree community and what we should be asking for as a community in terms of trees in our downtown?
Okay,
so those two policy questions.
I'll take the downtown one because I recently had the opportunity to walk around the downtown with a new city arborist and a couple other tree lovers. And I will just address the issues that need to be dealt with. Whether or not they're being dealt with might be a different discussion. There is some problems with the cohort of trees that we have in downtown Davis because some of the species are either on the types that are going out, like there's still Bradford pears downtown. There's a number of ash trees downtown. And let me just emphasize, there probably won't be any ash trees in the valley in 10 years because of the emerald ash borer. So we need to start planning for their replacement now. And there are some London plane trees and other types of sycamores downtown that have been pruned very, very severely and are extremely drought stressed. So a significant percentage of the trees downtown need help or need replacement, and more likely going to be replacement. If there's any downtown redevelopment, the tree plan has to allow for the appropriate species for a more congested area where you have limited planting areas. Very fastigiate growth habit in many cases will be necessary. That is to say, very upright. We have to be prepared for some jackhammering, some removal of concrete and asphalt in order to make a big enough tree well for larger trees to provide more shade in the downtown. And of course, the heritage trees that we have here and there in the downtown need to be conserved, which takes policy. That really does require to be written into the policy, particularly if there's going to be some redevelopment. So I'm concerned there is not adequate consideration for the existing trees that might be of value. I'm very concerned there is not adequate consideration for what we're going to have downtown 20 years from now and 30 years from now. A lot of the trees that I walk around and look at in the downtown right now won't be there 20 or 30 years from now. The replacements need to start going in fairly soon. One comment from Alan Hirsch, who's a real local tree activist who really monitors these things. They keep taking out bigger trees and planting little trees because for some reason in downtowns, people think of little trees. We need to focus on finding places for large trees, give them enough soil room to develop. So I just want to make sure the existing trees that are of value are adequately protected and that planning is done to get a better tree population in the downtown over the next, let's say, generation. That's about what it's going to take out and replace with other species.
I know, Don, I just want to comment that we have two plans, right? The tree management plan that you referenced in your presentation. Yeah. And there's been a lot of questions about whether the plan for trees for downtown belongs in the tree management plan or as like a neighborhood plan, or does it belong in the downtown plan? And the planners at the city kind of keep pushing it in different directions. So it's like sort of not their individual responsibilities to make sure the tree information is covered in either plan. And so I'm curious about Don and Emily and Greg, your thoughts about how do we get to this sort of neighborhood planning that we need to do? If it's not in the tree management plan, where's it going to be? For looking at, neighborhood by neighborhood and thinking of downtown as a neighborhood, which the downtown plan does think of itself as a neighborhood. Where is that grounded? Where is that planning going to happen?
Yeah, well, one update is the Charlie Murphy, the city forester, is working with Davey Resource Group to do a detailed inventory of all the tree planting sites downtown, which I think is a great first step. And I think once we, have the numbers in front of us, which show that a lot of these tree sites are cutouts, 4 by 4 foot cutouts, with decomposed granite that's heavily compacted, which doesn't provide enough room, soil volume for a healthy tree to grow. Then with that data, we can develop a plan for how to increase the soil volumes, how to diversify the species, and how to, through those individual actions of dealing with each planting site, increase the overall canopy of the entire downtown area. So I guess my thinking on it would be we need to develop a canopy cover target for the downtown area, and then get down to the individual site level with this inventory data to figure out, what do we do at each of these sites to increase the canopy by creating enough soil volume to get a healthy tree to live, for 20 to 50 years.
One of the things Tree Davis is doing right now is developing a technical advisory committee or technical advisory team with some local experts who can help us come up with lists of trees help us review these plans and just give our input to the tree commission, which is a appropriate place for that input, or directly to the city council as needed. You mentioned also neighborhoods. I think one of the things we really want to do with our public outreach and such is work with neighborhoods. This is a seminar that was, set up with Rancho Yolo and Village Homes, which are two existing neighborhoods. Davis Manor, Ostie Manor, many of the others have their own unique tree problems. I spoke to the Willowbank Association several years ago because much of Willowbank is covered with Chinese hackberry. Not only were they a nuisance pest issue with the ash whitefly, with the Asian woolly hackberry aphid, but also trees were dying. The hackberries were dying from some vascular disease, so they were losing their whole canopy. We will be happy to help as we develop databases and lists, provide information for plant materials. I do think I have a real concern about more asphalt and less trees. So that kind of gets to John's second question, which is about trees and solar panels. And just last year, 2 permits were pulled or went before the tree commission for, I believe, between them, 140 20-year-old trees in 2 parts of Davis to be removed, to be replaced in parking lots with solar panels. We have real concerns about the loss of existing healthy trees. It's a real conundrum, honestly, because we obviously want the benefits of solar energy, but we also don't want to lose not just the shading the trees provide, but the actual direct cooling of the air that they provide in geometrically increasing numbers, volumes as time goes by. So we gave some specific recommendations on that to the tree commission, which we hope will be incorporated into some kind of a long-term planning document. I guess the bottom line I will say is the city of Davis has a 50% parking lot shading requirement. We think it's real important that be retained. I'll just leave it at that.
And my addition to that would be that if we are going to have solar panels and trees, the trees are most beneficial if they are there located to shade where people are walking and the buildings. So, near the sidewalks and near parking stalls that are near the buildings, which are the ones that are used most frequently. Whereas on the periphery of the lot, away from the buildings, would be a better place for the solar panels because the trees would be less beneficial because there are fewer people and fewer buildings.
One thing I would say is that when solar panels do go in, they need landscaping. Landscaping has many of the benefits of trees, obviously not as big, but the landscaping needs to be appropriate as well. And as I mentioned earlier, landscaping appropriate plants around newly planted trees can be one of the simplest things you can do to help that tree get established. Looking at that illustration of how the roots go out, if there are plants being watered nearby, not so close as to compete with the new tree, but you're watering the grasses and the new shrubs and perennials, then you can actually enhance the whole ecosystem. Planting trees is great. We want you all to go out and do that. It'd be even better if you plant a tree and you bring in a water line to plant some things to complement that tree. So that gets us back to the topic of climate-ready landscapes, which is a new area for Tree Davis, and examples that you can see. And I think that's our next presentation by Emily Griswold.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, so Greg mentioned that Climate Ready Landscapes is one of the new initiatives of Tree Davis, one of our programs. And so what is a climate ready landscape? So we've been talking quite a bit about climate ready trees, but our urban forest has multiple layers. So it's not just the tree layer. We need to be considering the understory layer as well. And so climate ready landscapes use a diverse mix of drought tolerant native and adapted plants to accomplish multiple things. So we're looking at how do we improve the resiliency of the entire landscape in the face of climate change. So we're looking at heat, drought, but also the potential for floods and stormwater management. Also, with the biodiversity crisis kind of intersecting with climate change, there's an increasing need for our urban landscapes to perform important habitat functions as well to support biodiversity in cities. We can't just rely on natural areas out there where we go for a hike for biodiversity. We need biodiversity everywhere, including in our home landscapes. And then there is a thing too of just having thriving landscapes to support our own health and well-being. And it's really interesting to see the growing body of research looking at the health benefits of being in natural landscapes and particularly biodiverse landscapes. So that is an area where we're just still continuing to learn more and more. And of course, we want to make sure that future generations will benefit from these healthy green spaces. And so we're looking to the future for plants that will survive in our current climate and into the future. So it's been a rough summer. And yeah, so, you know, I manage gardens in multiple places. So I work with a huge team of volunteers in Central Park Gardens, and then also in the Arboretum. And I happened to be on a vacation during that big heat wave. And I came back and, you know, went to the Store Garden, which is like our drought tolerant valley-wide garden where we still have roses. And I don't know if there was an irrigation glitch or if it was just so hot that it looked like several of our plants had been hit with a blowtorch. And so this is a hybrid tea rose that just it had full exposure to the afternoon sun, and it just scorched that thing. So in the past, I was comfortable with putting roses in a drought tolerant plant garden, but my concept of like, what is a climate adapted plant is definitely shifting. Like these things are actively shifting. And then, you know, a week and a half later, our street flooded. So this is my husband right in front of our street, and he is like over ankle deep in water because the storm drains just couldn't handle the volume of water. So the storm drains weren't even blocked. So the water was like inching up our driveway. And these are the conditions that our landscapes need to tolerate because these things are going to be continuing to happen. So, and I've just been, you know, observing as I go on neighborhood walks. And what's really interesting to me is places where people have not been irrigating and seeing, you know, plantings that were really designed to be drought tolerant plantings and seeing what is surviving and what is just failing and dying. So side by side, this is Westringia, which is the Australian rosemary. I think of it as a pretty drought tolerant plant, but zero irrigation, didn't like it. This is a rock rose, a cistus, and especially after the rain, it perked right up. It was looking a little sad, perked right up after the rain, looks totally healthy right now. So these are the kind of tests that I'm observing more and more, like what is really doing well in these extreme environments. So I'm all about plant diversity. Like my favorite thing to do is make a bunch of plant lists. And so I'm kind of obsessed on the plant selection side of things. Like what are the things that we should be considering when we choose plants to put under our favorite trees? So one of the things to start with is if you have a mature tree, what are the irrigation needs of your mature tree? The plants that you plant under that tree should be able to be compatible with that same irrigation regime. So that's definitely a starting point. Or if you're planting everything together, you can match the tree that you plant with the surrounding landscape. But you want to make sure that those things are coordinated. If you're planting under a mature tree, it may be a shade garden that you're looking at. But if you're planting with a baby new tree, your plants are going to be in full sun for quite a while. And so you need to be selecting things that are going to be happy with full sun, and then we'll gradually get into more and more shade. What are your soil conditions? Is it compacted clay? Is it more sandy? These are all considerations with the plants that you choose. Many of our favorite drought tolerant plants want good drainage. And so if you do have compacted soil, having a little bit of topography where you can plant things up on mounds so that when we do have heavy rains, they're not sitting in a puddle, will help quite a bit. Another really important consideration is how much maintenance can you manage with this landscape? Are you an avid gardener where you're just going to be out there every day puttering? That will really expand the range of plants that you can grow. But if you're someone who kind of wants to plant it and forget it, then there are other types of plants that actually are very low maintenance. There is no zero maintenance garden. That does not exist. You always have to do something. But there are plants that don't require deadheading, cutting back, or much care to do well. Heat and drought tolerance, of course, that's part of our climate readiness, and also considering flood tolerance, especially if you have places where you're creating rain gardens or swales to absorb stormwater. And then providing habitat, that's an important piece to support urban biodiversity, and you can do that by particularly focusing on California native species, but then I always like to have a diversity of plants. So I can't limit myself just to native plants. I like to include plants from other similar climate regions. And many plants that have lovely flowers, they're going to attract native and non-native pollinators. And then, of course, for joy, having beauty year-round, having flowers year-round, and that also actually contributes to the habitat value of your landscape. So how do you then think about how to arrange your plants in the landscape? And one way to think about it is that you are actually kind of sculpting with plants and shaping a space. So just like there's a whole thing with interior design and architecture, outside, your tree canopy basically makes your ceiling. Shrubs can make walls. So you can make spaces that are more enclosed or make them more open. You can think about, where do you want to have views? Where do you want to screen things? Do you want to have an intimate space, or do you want to have more of a sense of open and expansiveness? So the heights of the plants that you choose and your spacing of them will really affect the feeling of the space. Adding layers always helps with supporting biodiversity. So that's, under your tree, you can have shrubs, you can have smaller ground covers under that. So I like adding a bunch of layers for diversity. And then, of course, you're going to be want to be looking at water flow on your property and making sure that there's a place for that stormwater to go. So you might incorporate swales or rain gardens for that. I am a plant collector, and so there's kind of a joke with horticulture people where it's like, oh, I have lots of drifts of one. So as opposed to having more repetition. But for like a beautiful, aesthetically pleasing design, often having repetition is more pleasing. And so thinking, as you're purchasing your plants, what are some of the backbone plants that you'll want to have several of? And it does actually make maintenance easier as well. And with design, there's so much fun you can have with color and pattern and shape. And it's not just flower color, it's leaf color, it's leaf texture. So I love playing with all those combinations. And my favorite thing is actually to go to a nursery where the plants are very portable and just experiment what looks good next to what. And playing with light, some things are just beautifully illuminated when they're backlit. So thinking about, where's the sun coming up and what will be my vantage point for when I see this thing. I'm usually not that sophisticated in how I plant. These things just kind of happen in a serendipitous way. And then I go, oh my God, that's so beautiful. I had no idea that was going to happen. And then from a maintenance perspective, how closely you plant your plants and what types of species you choose will affect your weed issues. And that is important. So some plants are really good at smothering weeds. And when you plant plants more closely, there's going to be more of that smothering and competition. So in terms of the best performing plants in like hot and dry conditions, these are the categories that I really am focusing on. What you'll see is that herbaceous perennials are not a category here, because generally herbaceous perennials, if you want them to look good in the summertime and not be all crispy, you need to water them more regularly. So even the native ones like California fuchsia, the California fuchsia that I don't irrigate looks kind of crappy right now, even though it is a native plant right here. So this is a traffic circle in my neighborhood that I lovingly call the climate apocalypse test garden. So it is surrounded by asphalt. There are neighbors who spend a little bit of time every year taking care of it, but to my knowledge, no one takes a hose over there and waters these plants. And so this is a really interesting place to see like what actually survives in this pretty harsh location. And the things that survive fall into these categories. So there are shrubs. One of them is this bird of paradise tree, Caesalpinia gillesii. Woody ground covers. This guy, Lemoniastrum. Oh my God, is the toughest plant on earth. Perennial grasses. So there's a Muhlenbergia here. So it's a muley grass that persists. There's succulents like this prickly pear and the bulbini over here. Bulbs, so you don't see them. This was a recent photo just from yesterday, actually. But you see those in the spring. They don't require any supplemental water at all. They just go dormant in the summertime. And then annuals, so there are poppies and calendulas that come up every spring in this area. So I'm not suggesting that this is like a beautifully designed landscape, but it is, to me, like interesting to see that you can have a fairly complex and diverse landscape with no irrigation. And so this is something that I'm interested in exploring more, and how to do this in a way that's really beautiful. So I'm just going to run through a few examples of some of these different categories of plants. And so you'll see that there's a mix of native species and non-native species. This is a Texas sage leucophyllum that is across the street from my house. And this is just from a couple days ago. That rain triggered this incredible bloom. You know, you couldn't even see the foliage. It was just solid flowers. So these are very tough plants that come from the Chihuahuan Desert and make really durable landscape shrubs. Moon Lagoon eucalyptus. So there are some eucalyptus that you can maintain in a shrubby state if you cut them down to the ground. So it is extra work, but it is such a tough plant. So in the summertime, all these other things are looking kind of bedraggled, and the Moon Lagoon is just like a beautiful silvery accent in the garden. Some of our natives that I really love are the California bush sunflower, that is great for pollinators. So if you want to have like loads of flowers in the spring, this is a good one. Might plant it a little towards the back because it does not look so good in the summertime. So I like to shear it back after its big bloom. And it naturally would go mostly drought deciduous in the summertime, but is great for a spring show. So some of the big three native shrubs in this area are manzanitas, ceanothus, and toyon. Of those, toyon is probably the most adaptable with these beautiful red berries. Flowers attract pollinators, fruits attract birds. It's just a fantastic large shrub and habitat plant. Ceanothus and manzanita are a bit finicky about soil. So those are ones where you want to get them up on a mound because they do not want to be in a swale or a rain garden. They do not want to have flooding around their root system. And then this is a Southern California desert species. The bladderpod has a unique caper family aroma, but has blooms year round, and especially in the wintertime, it's a great nectar source for hummingbirds. So woody ground covers. I might not have time to go through all of these, but I just wanted to show you examples of these woody ground covers. So because they're woody, they are kind of more tough and resilient than, say, an herbaceous ground cover like a dwarf plumbago or snow in summer or some of the other herbaceous ground covers. So these tend to have more drought tolerance. They're evergreen. You can go from, the silvery gray of this creeping saltbush to the lush green of a coyote brush. What's tricky with these is you want to be really careful about where you plant them. You don't want to plant them right near the edge of a walkway or something, because it's best if you give them enough space where they can really keep growing and growing. If you plant them too close to a walk, you'll find yourself always frustrated because it's always growing into the walkway. They want to go laterally. So you want to give them room to spread. That is their strength and their beauty. So don't crowd them. And they will be basically natural mulch that will suppress weeds. I am in love with grasses, and some of my favorite heat and drought tolerant grasses are the Muhlenbergias. So there's our native California deergrass, but then there are also several southwestern species. So bullgrass grows in the mountains of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And its flowers just like a week or two ago. So these are beautiful when they're backlit in the late evening light. They really just glow. The pine muley is like a smaller version of our native deergrass that's a little bit more refined and I think a bit more drought tolerant. And then this one is the undaunted muley. So this one is, if you've grown pink muley, which is Muhlenbergia capillaris, this one is a more drought tolerant species than that, Muhlenbergia reverconii. And there are some other ones that are perennial favorites. The eyelash grass, this canyon prince wild rye is extremely tough, but if you treat it too well, it will kind of take over your garden. But I love that silvery blue accent. So succulents, these are fantastic as sculptural accents. And there are so many succulents that are available right now. They're very popular. And for toughness, I really like agaves and aloes and yuccas, dazzlerians. So these kind of bigger, more sculptural, more spiky plants. There are some that are less aggressive and assertive. So the blue Nolina, we have been growing quite a bit in the Arboretum. Unlike the yuccas, it doesn't have dagger-like tips that will like impale you. And if you end up with a female plant, when it blooms, it is this is the flower. It's just like this torch when it's backlit. It's just the most incredible thing. So there are a lot of succulents like the echeverias and some of these other things that are like smaller succulents. Those are best in shade. They're not actually that drought tolerant in full sun. They just scorch. So that's something to be careful of. Just because something's a succulent doesn't mean it's heat and drought tolerant in full sun. Bulbs, what I love about bulbs is that most of the bulbs that are adapted to our climate, you don't need to irrigate at all because they just, when it's hot and dry, they just shrink down to their bulb and they don't need anything. So they're very self-sufficient, and there are a whole host of spring and fall blooming bulbs. So I'm kind of obsessed with fall blooming bulbs right now just because it's the season, and it's so relieving to see the fall bulbs come up at the end of the summer when everything's looking kind of like dreary and tired, and you get this kind of fresh hit of color. So there's a huge assortment of bulbs that we can grow in our climate, and many native bulbs too, like the Tritolea laxa, that are great for pollinators. And then annuals are another group of plants that are very adapted to our cool season rainfall cycle. So cool season annuals, they germinate with the fall rains, they bloom in the spring when it warms up, and then as it gets hot, basically they set seed and they die. So there is a thing where you have to kind of mow them back in the summertime, but in terms of spectacular spring blooms, they are unbeatable. Just California poppies, in terms of color and firepower, is a phenomenal plant. So how do you actually go from something like a lawn to a planting like this? So this is actually one of the most popular stories of all time on the Arboretum website. It's about Stacy Parker breaking up with her lawn, and she used cardboard. So this is the sheet mulching technique. So there's the smothering technique. So she used cardboard and a thick layer of mulch. There's also like mechanical methods where you could, so this was Central Park Gardens. This basically we converted a lawn into a meadow. In this case, they scraped off the top layer of soil. One of the big challenges when converting a lawn is if it has Bermuda grass in it, that is a persistent weed that you're going to want to make sure is like fully dead before you advance too far with understory plantings. It's fine if you're just planting trees. Bermuda grass is not going to compete significantly with a tree. But if you're trying to plant understory plants, this insidious plant will just continue to rise up if you haven't fully killed it. And so you can mechanically remove it by really thoroughly digging out the rhizomes. You can use herbicide. You can do like long time smothering. Like you'll need to smother at least a year, possibly more, to really get control of it. But if you don't take this seriously, it will basically take over and kind of ruin your landscape. So it's one of our barriers to landscape success. There is, so there are a lot of people who are into weed cloth. I am not one of them. So this is like what can happen with weed cloth over time. You can see someone did a drought tolerant landscape. They put down their weed cloth, they put their wood chips on top, and then they just kind of abandoned it. And like a hand from the grave, that weed cloth has resurrected. And meanwhile, they actually have weed seedlings coming up in their mulch, because what happens is organic matter falls on top of that weed cloth, it decomposes, makes nice compost, which becomes a seed bed for weed seedlings. So it is not a long-term solution. And now you have all this plastic waste in here. And if you have any like ground dwelling pollinators, you have created a barrier that keeps them from, you know, nesting in the soil. So please don't use weed cloth. In terms of irrigation for water conservation, drip is really the premier. And the best place to have drip for deep-rooted plants is to actually bury it subsurface. That is a more involved process, but we have had really the best success in the Arboretum where we have buried drip subsurface. One of the challenges with drip is if you have rodents, they can chew into it. So it is higher maintenance. And for that reason, a lot of our landscapes in the Arboretum are actually watered overhead, but it's challenging to get deep irrigation when you're using overhead water without having substantial runoff. So when planting, it's helpful to have like a design in mind in advance and be really careful about spacing so that you're thinking about the mature size of the plant and how much coverage you want over the landscape. My favorite way to plant is with a big group of people. So this is a Tree Davis planting in the Memorial Grove. So if you have a big landscape project, planting's usually fun. I say make it into a party. And then with establishment care, with the Tree Davis Memorial Grove, we have had folks actually out here hand watering these plants. And really there's no substitute for the gardener's footsteps. So this is me with Central Park Gardens many years ago with my watering can. And that is the best way, just keeping an eye on the plants. You want to make sure that they are well irrigated until they're fully established, which is at least through that first summer period. So just in terms of more information, there's the Arboretum All-Star website. Water use classification of landscape species database is another online resource. There are the UC landscape plant irrigation trials where they're actually testing the performance of plants at different irrigation levels. And then Don Shor has great resources on the Redwood Barn website. And then come visit. There's so many great places to get inspiration. Arboretum and Public Gardens, Central Park Gardens, the Tree Davis Memorial Grove. And then if you want to go a little further afield, Ruth Bancroft Garden in Walnut Creek is a great dry garden example. So that's that.
Thank you, Emily. That's a phenomenal number of plants. And to mention the site you showed there, the climate ready landscape that you showed is at Arroyo Park. Have I got that right? Yes.
It's basically just south of the University Retirement Community, the URC, along Shasta. So between Shasta and White Sands.
So we planted out there last year and some planting this year. And I was just over there a couple days ago. I suggest any of you that want to pursue this, head over there and take a look. There's many plants in bloom. They're beginning to fill in. You can see what it looks like in just a few months with a planting that was done and irrigated properly just after one of the hottest summer events we've had in my recollection here. The plants are doing just fine. The California fuchsias are blooming. The grasses look great. And this is real important, getting back to the whole point of this seminar. The young trees are establishing well. They're being hand watered, but the soil around them is also being watered deeply, infrequently, appropriately to the new plants that are in there. So the landscaping benefits the trees as much as it benefits the rest of us when you do it. As with this illustration, a young tree in the middle there, roots have probably already expanded past its planting hole out into the surrounding soil and getting the benefit of the nearby plants. There was a quick question that maybe we could answer, which is how close to the new trees can the new plants go? And then I think we'll be wrapping this up.
So it depends on how big the understory plant is. So if you're looking at like a woody ground cover that could spread even 8 feet wide, you're going to want to make sure that that is minimum 4 feet away from your young tree. There has been research that has shown that if you have like grasses growing right at the base of the tree, they will compete with the tree for water and nutrients. So you want to be at least 3 or 4 feet back from the tree trunk with your understory plantings with a new tree.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to turn it back to Chris, but first I want to thank again, Village Homes, Rancho Yolo, Cool Davis, and all the others that helped put this seminar together. Our speakers, Emily Griswold, Dr. Greg McPherson, and all of you out there who attended to get more information about planting trees, improving the urban forest, improving the landscapes around the urban forest. It's a really simple thing you can do. One of the simplest things you can do for your community is plant a tree and keep it watered for its first couple of summers. So that's something you can go home and do tomorrow. Again, thanks for attending, and I'll hand it back to Chris at this point.
Thank you, Don. I just wanted to let people know that, again, we have been recording this today, and all of the information that you've seen will try to get to you either in a follow-up email or sending you links to that those pieces, and also to the recording when it is posted. So we're really grateful for you all being here with us today. And I don't know if we want to do just a little applause for our panel and speakers for their time and effort. This was really fun for me, who's an avid gardener, to listen in on all of this today. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting, Chris.
Thank you. This is Elizabeth from Rancho Yolo, and I do want to thank everybody. And I want to thank Don Shor and all the people who made this possible. Really, thank you so much.